I want to tell you about a car. Not a murder weapon in the usual sense. No knife, no gun, no killer in the shadows. Just an ordinary cheap little economy car that millions of American families bought because it was affordable and it got good gas mileage. And I want to tell you about the moment a company sat down with a calculator and worked out, in cold dollars and cents, what a human life was worth, and decided that fixing a deadly flaw cost more than the people it would kill. That's the heart of the Ford Pinto story. It's not a story about one bad car. It's a story about what happens when human beings become a line item. Let's go back to the late 1960s. Ford Motor Company had a problem. Small, cheap cars from overseas, the Volkswagen Beetle, and a wave of Japanese imports were flooding into the American market and eating Ford's lunch. Detroit had spent decades building big, heavy, profitable cars, and suddenly young buyers wanted something tiny and economical. And the man determined to fight back was one of the most famous executives in American history. Lee Iacocca, then a rising star, and soon the president of Ford. Iacocca laid down a now legendary rule for the new car. It had to weigh under 2,000 pounds, and it had to cost under $2,000. The limits of 2,000, people called it. 2,000 pounds, $2,000. Anything that pushed the car over either line was the enemy. And there was one more pressure: speed. Not the car's speed, the schedules. A new car normally took around 43 months to design and bring to production. Iacocca wanted the Pinto done in about 25. They were in a hurry. They were on a budget. And those two facts, the hurry and the budget, are where the trouble begins. Here's the design problem, and I want to be precise about it, because the precision is what makes it chilling. On the Pinto, the gas tank was mounted behind the rear axle, in the space between the axle and the rear bumper. That was a fairly common layout at the time, but on the Pinto the execution was dangerous. There was very little crush space back there, only a matter of inches. The rear bumper was flimsy, little more than decorative, and right in front of the tank sat the differential housing, with bolt heads sticking out toward it like studs. So picture what happens in a rear-end collision. Another car strikes the Pinto from behind. The back of the car crumples. The tank is shoved forward, straight onto those protruding bolts, which can puncture it like a knife. At the same time, the filler neck, the pipe where you put the gas in, can tear away from the tank, opening a second leak. Now you have gasoline spraying into a crumpling car full of sparks and friction and hot metal, and the result, again and again, was fire, and not at some catastrophic, unsurvivable speed. That's the part that should make you sit up. Ford's own engineers crash-tested the Pinto before it ever went on sale. And in those tests, rear-end impacts at speeds as low as around 20 to 30 miles an hour, the kind of crash people walk away from every single day, ruptured the tank and produced leaking fuel. They knew. Before the first Pinto was ever sold to a single customer, the company had crash test data showing that in a moderate rear-end collision, this car could turn into a fireball. That is the fact at the center of everything that follows. They knew, and they sold it anyway. Now, why? Why would a company knowingly do that? And this is where we come to the single most infamous document in the history of corporate America. Inside Ford, a cost-benefit analysis was prepared. It's often called the Grush-Sonby Report, after the two engineers whose names are on it. And I have to be careful and honest here, because the popular version and the precise version are a little different, and both matter. The document was Ford's response to a proposed federal safety standard about fuel tank fires, and it covered all of Ford's cars and light trucks. about 12.5 million vehicles, not the Pinto alone. But what it did is what made it notorious. It put a literal price on the math of human life. The report laid it out like an accounting problem. On one side, the cost of fixing the fuel systems, roughly $11 per vehicle across 12.5 million vehicles, about $137 million. On the other side, the cost of not fixing them. They estimated the deaths and injuries and burned cars that would result, about 180 burn deaths, 180 serious burn injuries, 2,100 burned vehicles. And then they assigned dollar values to each, using figures the government itself had published. The value of a single human life in that calculation was $200,000. An injury, $67,000. A car, $700. Add it all up, and the cost of the deaths and injuries came to about $49.5 million. So there it was in black and white. $137 million to fix it. $49.5 million in dead and burned human beings if they didn't. The benefit of saving lives was less than the cost of the repair. The math said, let them burn. Now, Ford has always argued that this analysis was about a government rollover standard and not a decision to leave the Pinto unfixed. And on the narrow facts, that's a fair point. But it almost doesn't matter, because somewhere inside one of the largest companies on Earth, the lives of 180 people had been entered into a spreadsheet, given a price, and weighed against an $11 part. And the part lost. The $11, by the way, sometimes the estimates were even less, $5 or $6, could have bought a simple fix. A plastic shield between the bolts and the tank. A rubber liner inside it. A better filler neck. Small things. The price of 2 movie tickets standing between a family and a fire. For years, the public knew none of this. Then, in 1977, a journalist named Mark Dowie published an article in Mother Jones magazine titled Pinto Madness. It tore the lid off. Dowie laid out the crash tests, the memo, the $11 fix, the calculation of life against cost, and he made an explosive estimate that the Pinto's design had caused somewhere between 500 and 900 burn deaths. I have to flag that number honestly because it's the one that lodged in the public mind, and it is almost certainly far too high. Government figures and later scholars put the directly attributable death toll much lower, on the order of dozens, perhaps around 27 confirmed fire fatalities, not hundreds. But whether the number was 27 or 900, Dowie's article did something no recall notice could. It told America that a company had done the math on their lives. The outrage was volcanic, and then the cases came. The first that truly shook Ford was Grimshaw versus Ford Motor Company. In May of 1972, a woman named Lily Gray was driving her 6-month-old Pinto on a freeway near San Bernardino, California, with a 13-year-old boy named Richard Grimshaw in the passenger seat. The car stalled and was struck from behind. It burst into flames. Lily Gray died. Richard Grimshaw survived, but he was burned over most of his body. He would endure decades of surgeries, dozens upon dozens of operations, losing fingers, part of his ear, his nose, living the rest of his life disfigured by that fire. When the case reached a jury in 1978, and the jurors heard the crash tests and the cost-benefit reasoning, they were so appalled that they awarded Richard Grimshaw $125 million in punitive damages. At the time, the largest such award in American history. A judge later cut it down to $3.5 million, and an appeals court upheld the verdict in 1981. But the message had landed like a hammer. And then came Indiana, and something that had never happened before in American history. On August the 10th, 1978, 3 teenage girls, sisters Judy and Lynn Ulrich and their cousin Donna Ulrich, were driving a 1973 Pinto on a highway near Elkhart, Indiana. They were rear-ended by a van on U.S. Highway 33. The Pinto erupted in flames. Lynn and Donna died inside the car. Judy, the driver, was pulled out alive but so badly burned that she died in the hospital hours later. All 3 were gone, and a local prosecutor named Michael Cosentino did something audacious. He charged Ford Motor Company itself with reckless homicide, a criminal charge, not a lawsuit for money, a criminal prosecution of a corporation for killing people with its product. It was the first time in American history a company had been put on trial for criminal homicide over a defective product. The trial was held in the small town of Winnemac. And I'll be straight with you about how it ended, because the truth matters more than the drama. Ford was acquitted. In March of 1980, the jury found the company not guilty. The specific car was an older 1973 model with complications about which standards applied. The judge limited what evidence the jury could hear, and there were real questions about how fast that van had been going. Ford walked. But the very fact that it happened, that a corporation sat in a criminal dock accused of homicide, changed something permanently about how America thought of corporate responsibility. Meanwhile, the federal government had finally moved. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration investigated, and in 1978, it concluded the Pinto's fuel system was a genuine safety defect. Under that pressure, Ford agreed to recall about 1.5 million Pintos from the 1971 through 1976 model years, along with the nearly identical Mercury Bobcat, to fit them with the protective parts that should have been there all along. The fix, when it finally came, was cheap and simple, exactly as cheap and simple as the critics had said it would be. The Pinto limped on for a couple more years and was discontinued after 1980. Lee Iacocca, the father of the Limits of 2000, was fired by Henry Ford II that same year, over personality, not the Pinto, and went on to famous glory rescuing Chrysler. And the Pinto became something larger than a car. It became the textbook case, taught in business schools and law schools to this day, of corporate cost-benefit analysis colliding with human life. Now, I promised you honesty, so here's the uncomfortable other side. In 1991, a law professor named Gary Schwartz published a careful study called The Myth of the Ford Pinto Case, and he argued persuasively that a lot of the legend was wrong. The death toll was dramatically lower than Mother Jones claimed. The Pinto's safety record, he found, was actually about average for subcompacts of its era. Small, cheap cars were all dangerous in those years. And the infamous memo, he stressed, used the government's own numbers and was about that rollover standard, not a cynical decision to let Pinto owners burn. It's an important corrective, and I won't pretend it away. The Pinto may not have been the uniquely murderous death trap of popular memory. But here's what survives even the most skeptical reading, and it's the thing I want to leave you with. A company tested a car, saw it catch fire in survivable crashes, and sold it anyway. And somewhere in its files was a document that took human lives, assigned them a dollar value, and weighed them against the cost of a small part, and found the lives wanting. You can argue about how many people died. You cannot argue about the existence of the calculation. That's the real horror of the Pinto. Not the flames exactly. The arithmetic. The idea that a person sitting in a fireproof office can decide, with a sharp pencil and a clear conscience, that your life is worth $200,000 and an $11 part to save it is simply too expensive. Richard Grimshaw lived his whole life inside the scars of that arithmetic. Judy, Lynn, and Donna Ulrich died inside it. And every time you've ever heard a company weigh a recall against a lawsuit, you've heard the ghost of the Ford Pinto, still doing the math. Thank you for sitting with me here in the quiet dark. If this story stayed with you, leave a like so more people see it, subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one.